6 o'clock on a Tuesday morning. Cold basement air. A white envelope sitting flat on my wooden pressing table, directly under the harsh fluorescent bulb. 12 hours. That was the exact number printed on the civil summons in dark blue ink. 12 hours before my wedding venue deposit went into formal default and triggered an automatic $10,000 breach of contract penalty against my small tailoring LLC. I didn't move. My fingers were stiff from the damp chill that always settles into an unheated workshop before dawn. I mean, you have to understand that when you spend 5 years building something out of raw thread and discarded fabric, you get used to measuring structural stress. You learn to recognize when a seam is pulling too tight under tension long before the weave gives out. But staring at that paper, staring at a civil notice threatening to liquidate every piece of equipment in my shop, my thoughts just stopped. Honestly, if you've ever sat in the dark at 6 in the morning, holding a document that proves someone who shares your surname took a sledgehammer to the one milestone you spent half a decade starving yourself to build, you know the exact biological freeze I'm talking about. How do you even begin to process the audacity of a person who looks at your survival as optional, just to polish their own image? Have you ever had to measure the exact moment a family member decided your life's work was nothing more than cash waiting to be scraped off the table? Make no mistake, that $35,000 wasn't inherited money. It didn't come from a trust fund or a corporate bonus. It was built out of 80-hour work weeks in this very basement, altering heavy wool coats in the winter and hand-beating silk bridal gowns until my eyes burned under the shop lamps. Nothing is free. You have to... Look, I spent 6 months using a single pair of heavy rusted iron shears because I refused to spend $30 to get the blades professionally ground. Every single day, the dull metal ground against the joint of my right thumb, leaving raw, purple blisters that swelled and split by midnight. I wrapped them in scrap muslin and kept cutting. Why? Because $30 was $30. $30 meant 3 square inches of venue floor space. $30 meant keeping the deposit alive. My family knew the math. They watched me do it. But in my family, my labor was invisible, while my older sister Vanessa's lifestyle was treated like a sacred public monument. Let's just say Vanessa made a career out of selling an illusion. She called herself a luxury event planner, constantly tossing around corporate jargon about brand alignment, high-leverage networking, and high-value exposure. The crazy part is, the entire extended family swallowed it whole. They treated her like a local saint, this glamorous success story who was far too important to be questioned about mundane things like receipts or bank balances. And whenever I tried to talk about the sheer physical toll of my work, or the tight budget I was living on, Vanessa would just slide her designer sunglasses up her nose, laugh that airy, rehearsed laugh, and tell me I was trapped in a low-value mindset. She'd look at my calloused hands, turn to her fiancé Chad, and say that my pragmatic questions were ruining the positive energy of her agency's brand footprint. I remember the night I opened my independent alteration shop 3 years ago. I had spent 4 months painting the brick walls myself, sweeping out decades of coal dust, setting up 3 garment racks I found on a sidewalk clearance. I invited everyone. I baked a tray of small cookies, put out cheap paper napkins, and waited. 6 o'clock passed, 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock. Not a single member of my family walked through that door. And here's the kicker. Vanessa had intentionally announced an impromptu, high-networking engagement dinner at a downtown steakhouse at 7 o'clock that exact same night. She didn't even have a ring yet. It was just a party to celebrate the idea of her brand. My mother, Cynthia, had called me from the steakhouse bathroom to say they couldn't make my opening because supporting Vanessa's high-value client connections was critical for the family's public standing. I sat alone on the cold workshop floor at 9 p.m., eating a stale cookie beside empty garment racks, listening to the hum of the refrigerator. The only thing in this shop that ever gave me a sense of permanence was resting on the pressing board right next to that civil notice. A dense, calloused wooden tailoring ham that belonged to my late grandmother. Its heavy oak surface was scorched dark brown, scarred by thousands of scalding iron steam presses over 40 years of honest labor. My grandmother was the one who taught me that fabric doesn't care about your feelings, it only reacts to structural integrity. She used to hold my small hands against the wood and tell me that real strength isn't in pulling a garment until the threads snap. It's in trusting the invisible grain of the weave. And right beside that ham, hanging on the chrome garment rack under the dust cover, was Vanessa's latest trophy. A supposedly custom $15,000 Italian silk gown that she had brought into my shop 2 days ago, demanding I shorten the train for free before her weekend resort shoot. I looked at the dress hanging in the shadow, and that's when I saw it. A single, loose, unknotted thread trailing from the inner armhole seam, catching the fluorescent light like a tiny plastic filament. I didn't think much of it then. I just thought it was sloppy finishing. I had no idea that specific loose thread was the exact clue that was about to unravel her entire life. Truth be told, Vanessa never operated alone. She had a whole support system dedicated to maintaining her saintly image. There was Chad, her fiancé, who drove a leased luxury sports car that was paid for directly through Vanessa's consulting agency account. Chad loved Sunday dinners at my mother's house. He would sit at the head of the table, clinking his heavy glass, making casual jokes about my rough skin and the lint stuck to my sweaters, asking if my little shop was making enough pennies to buy real food yet. My mother would just smile and pass him the serving platter, nodding like he was royalty. Cynthia, my mother, lived in a state of permanent indoctrination. To her, protecting Vanessa's public prestige wasn't just a preference, it was her life's mission. If Vanessa wanted something, Cynthia made sure the rest of us accommodated it. If I raised a concern about money, Cynthia would press her hands over her heart, sigh deeply, and accuse me of trying to ruin the family's reputation out of bitter jealousy. The only person who ever looked at me with actual human eyes was Marco, the elderly cobbler whose repair shop shared the damp alleyway behind my basement door. Marco had been fixing leather soles for 50 years. He knew the sound of my heavy iron pressing board at 5 in the morning. And then there was my younger half-sister Maya. Maya was 19, working 2 part-time jobs while trying to save for her college textbooks. Her small $5,000 education fund was tucked into the exact same joint bank umbrella account that held my wedding venue savings, an account my mother had set up years ago under the guise of family financial alignment. I picked up the civil notice. The paper was stiff and crisp in my calloused hands. The venue had given me until 6 o'clock that evening to produce the $35,000 deposit, or the reservation was voided, the contract was breached, and my tailoring LLC was going to be dragged into civil collection courts. My wedding was 4 months away. $35,000. 5 years of blistered thumbs, dull iron shears, unheated winters, and missed dinners. I looked down at my phone, resting on the iron board. The screen was dark, but I already knew what a quick check of my online bank portal had confirmed 20 minutes ago. The balance was 0, not low, not pending. 0. Every single cent had been transferred out via an authorized wire transfer at 3 o'clock the previous afternoon. And as I stared at that blank screen, the low, rhythmic hum of the basement water heater echoed through the concrete walls. A slow, ticking reminder that the clock was officially running. The line item on the screen was brutal in its clarity. Authorized wire transfer, $35,000. Recipient, Vance Media and Events LLC. Timestamped yesterday at 3:14 p.m. Right below that notification, sitting in my inbox like a spit in the face, was an automated message from Vanessa. A $10 e-gift card to a national coffee chain. Her little attached note read, Nora, thanks for your quiet support during my agency's high-leverage brand expansion. Grab a latte on me. My throat constricted so fast I couldn't catch air. You know, when a thread under maximum tension snaps inside a high-speed sewing machine, the bobbin thread violently bunches up into a tangled, jammed knot underneath the needle plate. That's exactly what my lungs did. The cold air in the basement felt like dry wool catching in my trachea. $35,000. My venue deposit. My milestone. She hadn't just taken the money. She had disguised a massive betrayal as a casual sisterly favor, handing me a $10 paper cup while she gutted my future. If you've ever had to stare at a digital screen showing a zero balance while holding a passive-aggressive $10 gift card from a sister who treated you like the family scapegoat, tell me, how did you survive that first hour without completely losing your sanity? Like, how do you handle the sudden, sickening realization that your financial ruin was planned out over coffee while you were blistering your fingers at a sewing table? I didn't even put on a coat. I drove 3 miles up the road to my mother's house, my hands trembling so hard against the cold steering wheel that my knuckles turned paper white. The front door was unlocked. Vanessa was sitting at the mahogany dining table with her laptop open, sipping iced coffee while Chad leaned over her shoulder, pointing at a high-end resort brochure. My mother was standing by the china cabinet, polishing a silver gravy boat. "Where is it?" I said. My voice was raspy, stripped raw. "Where is the $35,000, Vanessa?" Vanessa didn't even jump. She didn't flinch. She just slowly closed her laptop screen halfway, adjusted her gold watch, and looked up at me with this insufferably patient smile. "Nora, please," she said, waving her hand as if she were dismissing a noisy waiter. "We are in the middle of reviewing promotional collateral for my agency's summer rollout. You don't need to storm into Mom's house like, 'You forged my signature on a bank wire!'" I stepped toward the table, the floorboards groaning under my boots. "You drained my wedding account! The venue deposit defaults at 6 p.m. today!" "Look, let's just say your venue deposit was stagnant capital," Vanessa said, her voice dripping with calculated composure. "You had 35 grand sitting in an underperforming account doing nothing for your overall brand equity. I reallocated those assets to secure a high-leverage promotional partnership for my firm. It's an investment in the family's broader financial ecosystem. You should be thinking about the high-value ROI instead of fixating on petty receipts." "It was my money!" I screamed, the sound tearing out of my chest. 5 years of work! 5 years of blistered thumbs! "Hey, watch your tone in this house!" Chad snapped, stepping forward, his designer loafers squeaking on the hardwood. "Vanessa is building an actual enterprise here. You're making a scene over—" "Chad, stay out of this." I turned back to Vanessa. "I am calling the bank fraud line right now. I am filing a formal affidavit." That's when my mother dropped her silver polishing cloth. She didn't ask Vanessa if she took the money. She didn't ask to see the bank transfer. Instead, Cynthia let out a dramatic, strangled gasp, clutching both hands tightly over her sternum. Her eyes rolled back slightly as she stumbled against the edge of the dining table. "My heart," Cynthia gasped, her voice cracking into a pathetic, wheezing sob. "Nora, stop it! You're giving me a stroke! My blood pressure is spiking. I can feel it in my neck. You're going to put me in the emergency room over a personal family misunderstanding." She sagged into a dining chair, hyperventilating loudly, fanning her face with a paper napkin. Vanessa instantly rushed to her side, pouring a glass of water, shooting me a cold, venomous glare. "Look what you're doing to Mom," Vanessa hissed. "You're so obsessed with your little budget that you're willing to give our mother a hypertensive crisis. You are completely unstable, Nora." "I want my money back," I whispered, my teeth rattling together, "or I go to the bank." Vanessa stood up straight, leaning across the table, her eyes narrowing into two thin slits. The saintly mask vanished for 3 seconds, revealing the cold iron underneath. "Go ahead," Vanessa said softly. "Call the fraud department, but remember who else is attached to that joint bank umbrella account, Nora. Maya's $5,000 college book fund is sitting in the exact same legal sub-tier. The moment you initiate an adverse fraud investigation, the bank automatically freezes the entire umbrella line for 90 days. Maya's tuition clearance is due on Friday. If you file that report, her book fund is locked, her registration is canceled, and she gets dropped from her classes. Do you really want to ruin your little sister's college future just to throw a panic attack over a temporary capital transfer?" I stood there in the quiet dining room, listening to my mother's forced, dramatic gasps for air and the steady ticking of the grandfather clock. They had wrapped the trap so tight around my neck that any movement I made would choke my 19-year-old sister instead. I turned around and walked out. I didn't say another word. By 7:30, I was back down in my dark basement workshop. The air smelled of wet wool, iron rust, and old, cold cement. I didn't cry. I couldn't. My body was in absolute total system lockdown. I plugged in the heavy industrial steam iron. The copper coils groaned as they heated up. I lifted a dark, heavy wool winter coat onto the pressing board, a customer's coat that needed its shoulder seams flattened. I lifted the heavy iron in my right hand, my thumb throbbing against the raw blister left by my rusted shears. Ping! My phone on the shelf emitted a sharp, high-pitched tone. An automated text alert from my bank. Account status notice. Overdraft protection inactive. Joint umbrella balance below maintenance threshold. I stopped. My right arm was extended, holding the 12-pound iron exactly 1 inch above the dark wool fabric. And I just froze. I couldn't lower the iron. I couldn't set it back on the metal rest. My shoulder muscles locked into rigid stone. The hot steam began to hiss out of the base vents, rising in thick white plumes that wrapped around my pale face and condensed on my eyelashes. 1 minute passed. 2 minutes. 3 minutes. The scalding vapor washed over my skin, but I didn't feel the heat. All I could process was the cold, brutal arithmetic running through my brain. $35,000. 5 years. 780 weekends spent in this basement while Vanessa posted photos of champagne brunches. 1,800 days of eating cold soup so I could save every penny for a venue that would cancel my contract in 10 hours. 5 minutes. 6 minutes. 6 minutes. The iron hovered in midair, a heavy block of burning metal held motionless by a body that had simply run out of capacity to process the betrayal. In that cloud of steam, a memory floated up. A ghost memory I hadn't thought about in 15 years. I remembered sitting on my grandmother's knee in her old kitchen while she mended a torn linen tablecloth. She had handed me a dull brass thimble and told me that when a seam tears, you don't fight the thread. You look at why the fabric failed under stress. "Nora," she had whispered, her rough thumb rubbing my cheek. "Some clothes can't be patched, child. When the warp is rotten, any new thread you add just pulls the hole bigger." At 8 minutes, the automatic safety shutoff inside the iron clicked with a dull metallic snap. The steam ceased rising. I slowly lowered the cold iron onto its silicone pad. I reached up with the back of my calloused wrist and wiped the steam condensation from my eyes. The shaking in my hands was gone. The biological panic that had been fluttering in my ribs for 2 hours died down into a quiet, absolute zero. I looked at the dark wool coat on the table. I looked at the loose thread hanging from Vanessa's gown across the room. They thought I was going to swallow this because I always swallowed it. They thought my mother's fake medical scenes and Vanessa's corporate jargon were going to keep me trapped in the scapegoat role forever. I stepped over to my tool rack and picked up my heavy iron shears. I didn't press the wool. I didn't check my bank balance again. I was done trying to patch a rotten seam. It was time to start unpicking the structure, thread by cold thread. In garment construction, every fabric has a breaking strain, a precise mathematical limit where tension overrides structural integrity. When a weave is rotten at the warp, no amount of delicate hand stitching or expensive thread will keep the garment together under pressure. For 5 years, I was the designated seam in this family, taking all the structural strain, swallowing the invisible labor, absorbing the quiet insults, and letting my own thumbs blister so their public monument wouldn't tear. I genuinely believed that if I just worked harder, if I just pressed the seams tighter and kept my head down, the math would eventually balance. But staring at that dark wool coat in the cloud of scalding steam, the cold reality finally settled into my marrow. You cannot budget, outwork, or outlove a family structure that requires your total biological bankruptcy just to stay together. Continuing to patch their rotten seams wasn't an act of sisterly nobility. It was an act of quiet, systematic self-harm. My empathy wasn't holding us together. It was just the cheap thread they were burning through to finance their own illusion. At 9:15 that morning, the brass bell above my basement door rattled violently. I didn't even have to look up from my cutting board to know who it was. The sharp, rhythmic clicking of high-heeled boots on the concrete steps told me everything. Vanessa swept into the room, trailing a heavy cloud of expensive synthetic perfume that instantly cut through the damp smell of old steam and wool. She was carrying a long, black garment bag draped carefully over her forearm, her face set in that sharp, hurried expression she always used when she wanted to command a room. "Nora, I need you to drop whatever you're doing right now," she said, her voice echoing off the brick walls as she unzipped the bag with a sharp, metallic slide. "The seam along the left armhole on my couture gown is sitting completely crooked, and the train needs to be taken up 2 inches before my 11 o'clock resort shoot tomorrow. And don't start about your schedule. This shoot is critical for my agency's regional press release." She pulled the dress out of the plastic cover and laid it across my pressing table. It was a floor-length, off-the-shoulder ivory gown, the dress she had been bragging about to the entire family for 3 weeks, claiming it was a custom $15,000 piece imported directly from an atelier in Milan. For a microsecond, my chest tightened. That old, deeply conditioned survival instinct, the scapegoat reflex I had carried since childhood, flared up in my throat like a hot ember. My hands actually hovered over my tray of straight pins, shaking slightly. A part of my brain, conditioned by 20 years of my mother's guilt trips, tried to whisper that maybe I should just take the dress, fix the seam, and keep my head down. Maybe I should just swallow the theft, protect Maya's college fund, and find some way to beg the venue for an extension. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I could hear the pulse in my ears. I felt sick to my stomach. The fear of confronting her, the sheer habit of submission, was trying to pull me under. My hand reached toward the ivory fabric to begin pinning the hem just to stop her from raising her voice. Then, my thumb brushed against the inner waist seam, and my entire world stopped. Look, when you spend 10 years working as a garment structuralist, your hands don't process fabric the way normal people do. You don't just see a dress. Your nervous system instantly reads the thread count, the bias drape, the weave tension, and the exact weight of the warp and weft. Real mulberry silk has a fluid, weightless warmth. It glides over calloused skin with a soft, matte resistance. The fabric under my thumb didn't glide. It had a stiff, rigid warp, a synthetic plastic sheen, and a distinct scratchy friction that made my skin prickle. I didn't say a word. I pulled my heavy desk lamp closer, swinging the 5,000 Kelvin daylight bulb down until it was 3 inches from the inner armhole. I turned the garment inside out. High-end Milanese couture uses hand-stitched French seams, Invisible, delicate silk threads wrapped neatly inside the seam allowance so no raw edge ever touches the skin. But under the glare of my lamp, the inner construction of this supposedly $15,000 gown was an absolute disaster. The thread tension was completely asymmetrical. The stitches were puckered, pulled unevenly along the bias line, and finished with a cheap 3-thread monofilament nylon overlock, the kind of machine stitching executed by high-speed commercial sergers running at 4,000 revolutions per minute in mass production factories. I reached into the side seam near the hip, where the structural care label should have been sewn into the lining. There was no woven silk label. Instead, right at the seam intersection, I saw a tiny, jagged stub of stiff white polyester fabric, the unmistakable remnant of a cheap factory production tag that had been frantically cut out with a pair of blunt household scissors, leaving frayed synthetic threads sticking out of the seam allowance. And right on the surviving edge of that cut stub, printed in microscopic black ink, was a factory registration code. RN 104928CN. My trade database was open on the laptop beside my iron. I didn't even look at Vanessa. While she stepped over to the basement window to check her phone and adjust her lipstick in the glass reflection, I typed that factory registration number directly into my wholesale garment importer portal. The result popped up in less than 3 seconds. Item name: Aurelia Synthetic Satin Bridal Gown, Bulk Import. Wholesale manufacturer, Guangzhou Apex Garment Exports. Unit price, $299.99. I stared at the monitor screen. $299. The math didn't just click. It slammed into my brain like a lead weight. Vanessa hadn't bought a $15,000 Milanese gown. She had ordered a $300 mass-produced knockoff from an overseas fast fashion warehouse, cut the factory tag out with kitchen scissors, and paraded it in front of our family as haute couture, which meant she hadn't reallocated $35,000 to buy business assets or invest in high-leverage agency inventory. She had spent exactly $300 on a fake dress, and she had pocketed the remaining $34,700 of my stolen wedding money to pay for a 4-day luxury resort weekend, champagne catering, and a hired photography crew to shoot fake promo content for her social media page. The conditioned fear inside me didn't just die. It turned to cold ash. Vanessa turned around from the window, tapping her manicured nails impatiently against her leather purse. "Nora, are you listening to me? I need that train pinned right now. I have a strategy call with my publicist in 20 minutes. I need to step upstairs to grab a specific gauge of silk thread," I said. My voice was completely flat, devoid of any tremor, any anger, any emotion whatsoever. "Give me 5 minutes." "Fine, but hurry up," she grumbled, sitting down on my wooden stool and pulling out her phone. "My time is extremely valuable today." I walked over to my desk, picked up my tablet, and logged into the secure online document portal for our family's joint bank umbrella. The portal my mother had given me access to years ago so I could monitor Maya's college sub-account. Now that I knew the exact dollar amounts and the corporate entity name, Vance Media and Events, LLC, I didn't need the guess. I ran a formal document query across the umbrella profile, pulling down the full, unredacted transaction logs that had been processed over the last 48 hours. 2 specific legal files appeared on my screen, attached directly to the umbrella account's master filing index. I opened the first file. It was a certified digital transaction receipt issued directly by the bank's commercial fraud monitoring system. I read the text verbatim off the glowing screen. Transaction ref, #TXN-88402-CN. Vendor, Guangzhou Apex Garment Exports. Amount, $300. Primary account, Vance Media and Events LLC checking account. Funding source, direct authorized wire number WT-9921. $35,000 transferred from Nora Vance Savings. There it was. the exact paper trail linking my stolen wedding deposit directly to the purchase of her fake dress. Then I opened the second document, a file that had been uploaded to the umbrella directory just 3 days ago. My breath caught in my chest, not out of panic, but out of pure, unadulterated shock at the level of destruction sitting in front of me. It was a commercial loan application from a private, high-interest lending firm. I read the heading and the signature lines verbatim. Commercial Guarantee Agreement, Loan Number 4920-B. Principal amount, $20,000. Primary debtor, Vance Media and Events, LLC. Designated co-signer and personal guarantor, Cynthia Vance. Authorization status, executed via digital signature. Vanessa hadn't just stolen my $35,000. To secure her agency's expansion loan, she had secretly accessed my mother's personal identification details and forged Cynthia's name as a co-signer on a $20,000 predatory personal loan with a 32% annual interest rate. A loan that was scheduled to enter first payment default in less than 30 days, exposing my mother to immediate civil asset garnishment. I looked down at the third piece of evidence sitting on my screen. The raw system metadata log generated during the wire transfer. System log, wire transfer number WT-9921. Originating IP address 172.56.21.8. Registered location, Vance Media Office desktop. Device MAC address 001A, 2B, 3C, 4D, 5E. User credentials used, Nora Vance, fraudulent mimic authorization. 3 distinct, undeniable receipts. The synthetic dress receipt proving the theft of my funds, the forged guarantee agreement proving she was about to bankrupt our mother, and the digital IP log proving she personally executed the wire from her office computer while pretending it was an automated banking error. I closed the tablet screen. The silence in my basement workshop was heavy, thick, and absolute. I looked over at Vanessa sitting on my stool, completely absorbed in her phone, tapping the screen, smiling at her own reflection, entirely oblivious to the fact that the entire structural integrity of her fake life had just been laid out on my cutting table. She thought she was a corporate alpha playing high-stakes chess with low ROI victims. She didn't realize that when you bring a fake dress to a master tailor, you aren't showing off your luxury. You're handing her the exact loose thread needed to pull your entire house down. I stepped into the back storage nook behind the heavy canvas cutting curtains, where the damp cold of the foundation wall hit my face like a wet towel. My breath came out in short, quiet vapors. Look, you have to understand that when a parasite attaches itself to a family system, it always secures a hostage first. Vanessa knew exactly what she was doing when she chained Maya's college book fund to that joint umbrella account 3 years ago. She built herself a human shield out of our 19-year-old sister's future. If I struck back at the unauthorized transfer directly through a formal civil law enforcement filing, the bank's automated risk protocol would instantly freeze every single sub-account under the umbrella entity. Maya's $5,000 would be trapped in administrative limbo for 90 days. Her tuition clearance deadline was Friday at midnight. She would be purged from her sophomore classes before the bank even assigned an investigator to review my file. Vanessa thought that shield was impenetrable. She thought the fear of hurting Maya would keep me paralyzed in this basement forever. My hands were cold. So cold my fingers felt stiff as wooden pegs. But they didn't shake. I pulled my personal cell phone from my apron pocket, dialed the direct extension for the bank's private civil compliance unit, and pressed the receiver hard against my ear. Civil fraud and fiduciary compliance. A calm, measured voice answered on the second ring. This is Administrator Vance. Please state your account reference. Umbrella account ending in 402, I whispered, my voice barely louder than the hum of the old water heater behind me. I kept my eyes glued to the gap in the canvas curtain, watching Vanessa's shadow through the fabric as she paced back and forth near my iron, complaining loudly to someone on her headset about a delayed catering delivery. I am the designated co-trustee on the sub-tier ledger. I need an emergency administrative partition. A total account freeze requires a 60-day formal review, ma'am. I'm not asking for a total freeze, I interrupted softly, my callous thumb pressing against the edge of the tablet frame. I am reporting an unauthorized signature on the master umbrella line, but under Section 8 of the Joint Fiduciary Agreement, as the legal guardian of Sub-Tier B, the Minor Educational Trust, I am exercising my right to execute an immediate, unilateral asset quarantine. I need my advance's $5,000 carved out and transferred into an independent, single-signatory account before 12 o'clock today. Silence filled the line for 4 agonizing seconds. All I could hear was the faint, rhythmic ticking of the wall clock and the distant sound of Vanessa's heavy gold bracelets clinking against her phone case. To execute a unilateral sub-tier partition without the primary account holder's consent, you must upload verified evidence of an adverse material breach on the master line, the compliance officer said, her keyboard clacking softly in the background. Do you have the certified documentation? I am holding the digital metadata logs, the offshore supplier purchase order, and the unauthorized wire authorization timestamp, I said. My throat felt dry, like swallowing sand, but my tone was steady. I'm uploading the files to your secure portal right now. I tapped the tablet screen, and then the real torture began. Because when you are standing in a dark basement nook 6 feet away from the person who just destroyed your life, waiting for a secure banking server to verify cryptographic signatures is an eternity. There was no flashy animation on the screen, just a dull gray status box flashing 3 quiet words over and over. Verifying authentication hash. Verifying authentication hash. My palm was sweating against the glass casing of the tablet. Cold drops of perspiration ran down my spine, making my cotton shirt stick to my shoulder blades. Outside the curtain, I heard the sharp, metallic snap of Vanessa's purse closure. "Nora!" Her voice barked, closer now. Her boots creaked against the floorboards right on the other side of the canvas. "What are you doing back there? I don't have all morning for you to find a spool of thread." My heart slammed against my ribs like a trapped bird. I held my breath, my finger hovering over the phone's mute button. "Just pulling the matching silk gauge from the high shelf, Vanessa," I called out, my voice smooth, entirely detached from the adrenaline surging through my blood. 2 minutes. "Well, move it," she muttered, her footsteps pivoting back toward the pressing table. "My publicist is waiting on these venue previews." On the tablet screen, the gray status box suddenly flickered. The blinking text disappeared, replaced by a quiet, solid blue confirmation banner. Sub-Tier B asset partition complete. Fund isolation confirmed. Account number 8810 established under single beneficiary authority. "The partition is locked, Ms. Vance." The compliance officer's raspy voice came through the earpiece. "Sub-Tier B is officially severed from the master umbrella. The $5,000 is isolated and completely untouchable by the primary entity. The master umbrella remains open for your formal adverse claim." I closed my eyes for 2 seconds, letting a long, shaky breath flow out through my nose. The hostage was safe. Maya's tuition was untouchable. The legal shield Vanessa had spent 3 years hiding behind had just been surgically cut away from her flank, and she didn't even know she was standing bare in the open. "Thank you," I whispered, and disconnected the call. I slid the phone back into my apron pocket, wiped my wet palms on my work towel, and grabbed a random spool of white silk thread from the rack. When I stepped back through the canvas curtain, Vanessa was standing by my cutting table, tapping her manicured nails against her designer purse, her face twisted in that familiar, condescending sneer. She had no idea that the room had just lost its air. She thought she was still holding the leash. She sat there looking at her fake dress, completely oblivious to the fact that the only thing keeping her out of total civil ruin was the 10 feet of concrete between my cutting table and the notary's desk up the street. Vanessa zipped the black garment bag with a loud, metallic drag, threw it over her shoulder, and marched up my basement steps without a single word of thanks. The heavy wooden door slammed shut behind her, sending a shower of fine white plaster dust down onto my cutting table. Silence fell over the basement again. Heavy, cold, and loud. I looked at the clock on my wall. 11:15 a.m. Less than 7 hours before my wedding venue deposit contract officially expired. The adrenaline was hitting my bloodstream in sharp, erratic waves, making my chest feel tight, like someone had wrapped heavy cord around my ribs and pulled the knot flush. My phone on the pressing board started buzzing. Not a single call, a barrage of rapid, consecutive vibration bursts that made the wooden table hum. I picked it up. The main family group chat was blowing up. Vanessa had already started. Family, her first text read, framed by a soft blue speech bubble. I'm asking everyone to please keep Nora in your thoughts today. She is going through an extremely difficult emotional episode and experiencing severe mental instability regarding her upcoming wedding planning. We are doing our best to hold healthy boundaries with her, but please send her positive energy. My mother's response followed 3 seconds later. Thank you for being so patient with her, Vanessa. She nearly gave me a hypertensive crisis this morning with her outburst. I am praying she finds peace and stops projecting her anger onto our family. A cousin chimed in with a series of praying hand emojis. An aunt posted a link to a blog article about managing irrational family envy. They were laying the groundwork. They were building a public wall of therapy speak around me so that when my venue deposit defaulted at 6 p.m. and I inevitably spoke up, every relative in the state would already believe I was just an unstable, jealous sister throwing a delusion-driven tantrum. And then the mistake happened. At 11:22 a.m., a new message popped up in the main group chat. It wasn't meant for the group. The typing preview bounced for 4 seconds before the text landed. Make sure Nora signs the venue liability transfer tonight before she realizes the bank account was cleared for my resort campaign. Just pretend it's an insurance update. My breath hitched in my throat. My thumb froze over the glass screen. 1 microsecond passed. 2 microseconds. Message deleted by sender. A second later, Vanessa typed into the chat. So sorry, everyone. Autocorrect scrambled a message intended for my assistant about venue logistics. She thought she was fast. She thought 4 seconds was enough time for a text to disappear into the digital void. But my fingers had already executed the muscle memory of a person who survives on evidence. Click, screenshot captured. Time-stamped, saved to my local drive, and backed up to my cloud storage. There it was, written in her own words, sent from her own phone number. The explicit admission that she had cleared my account for her resort shoot and was actively planning to trick me into signing a liability release to cover her tracks. I didn't reply in the chat. I didn't send an angry emoji. I just downloaded the image file, opened my desktop printer interface, and sent 4 crisp color copies directly to the heavy laser printer on my office shelf. The machine whirred to life, its internal rollers heating up, the sharp smell of hot black toner filling the cool air of the workshop. Pages slid out, one by one, into the plastic tray. The $300 offshore receipt for the fake synthetic gown, the forged $20,000 commercial loan application with my mother's name signed in digital script, the wire transfer metadata log showing her office IP address, and now, the time-stamped screenshot of her deleted text message. I picked up the 4 sheets of heavy paper. The toner was still warm against my fingertips. My phone buzzed again. A direct text from Vanessa. Meet me in the parking lot outside the escrow office at 1:45 p.m. You need to adjust the temporary pins on my hem before I step inside for my expansion filing. Even now, even after accidentally dropping her confession into the family chat, her arrogance was so absolute, her belief in my total submission so deeply ingrained that she expected me to act as her personal wardrobe assistant on the sidewalk before her meeting. I walked up the steps, stepped out into the damp alleyway, and headed toward the small cobbler shop next door. The heavy wooden door of Marco's shop creaked as I pushed it open. He turned away from his sanding wheel, the heavy smell of barge cement and dark shoe polish filling the warm air between us. He looked at the white envelope in my hand, his dark, stain-lined fingers resting flat on his leather apron. "You're trying to calculate an emotional debt with people who only understand transactional math, Nora," Marco muttered, his raspy voice cutting through the hum of the exhaust fan. "Listen to me. Family isn't the people who tally up your exact depreciation before deciding if you get a seat at their table. It's the people who stand with you in the freezing rain, never once doing the math on what you cost them." He picked up a dense block of yellow beeswax and pressed it into my palm. "Stop resewing a rotten hem for people who view your loyalty as free labor. Cut the thread." "I'm cutting it, Marco," I whispered. At 1:35 p.m., I pulled my beat-up hatchback into the commercial parking lot behind the escrow office. The sun was burning through the haze, casting long, sharp shadows across the hot asphalt. Vanessa's leased luxury SUV was parked right near the front entrance, gleaming under the bright afternoon light. She was standing by the open passenger door, wearing her oversized designer sunglasses, holding a $12 iced matcha latte in one hand, while frantically scrolling through her tablet with the other. As soon as she saw me walk up, carrying my small repair kit, she scoffed loudly and gestured toward the dirty asphalt. "Finally!" she snapped, not even looking at my face. "The left side of this synthetic drape is pulling at the hip. Crouch down and fix the pin alignment right now. My publicist is meeting us inside in 10 minutes, and I cannot have the drape looking uneven in the promotional photo." I didn't argue. I didn't say a word. I dropped down onto my knees on the hot, dusty concrete of the parking lot. The rough pebbles bit through the fabric of my trousers, pressing hard against my kneecaps. I pulled a straight pin from my magnetic cushion, reaching under the hem of her synthetic gown, feeling the cheap, stiff warp of the $300 dress beneath my calloused fingers. Above me, Vanessa took a loud sip of her drink, let out an exhausted sigh, and began complaining into her headset. "Honestly, the dealership completely botched the interior package on my new SUV," she whined into the microphone, her voice carrying across the quiet lot. "I explicitly requested the cognac Italian leather, and they delivered this flat saddle brown. It's completely ruining my brand aesthetic when I film drive-along content. It's just so exhausting dealing with low-value service providers who don't understand baseline quality." I held the steel pin between my thumb and forefinger, kneeling in the dirt, listening to the woman who had just stolen my life savings complain that the leather seats in her luxury car weren't the exact shade of brown she wanted. "Look, if you were kneeling on hot concrete, holding a pin between your teeth while the person who just drained your entire $35,000 wedding fund complained that her leased luxury vehicle had the wrong shade of leather, tell me, would you have had the sheer willpower to swallow that humiliation for 10 more minutes just to make sure she walked through the office door without suspecting a thing?" I pushed the steel pin smoothly through the cheap polyester hem. "It's pinned, Vanessa," I said, rising slowly from the asphalt, brushing the white dust from my knees. "About time," she muttered, sliding her tablet into her leather tote and smoothing her skirt. "Grab my ring light from the trunk and bring it inside. You're going to hold it for my entry video." I picked up my thick white envelope from the front seat of my car. I looked at the dark glass windows of the escrow office building. It was 1:55 p.m., 4 hours and 5 minutes before my venue deposit contract defaulted. I followed her through the heavy double glass doors, stepping into the air-conditioned quiet of the building, my boots clicking softly against the polished terrazzo floor. The air inside the escrow office was dead, cold, and smelled faintly of floor wax, old paper, and stale coffee. A round plastic clock on the wall above the laminate desk ticked with a heavy, hollow click every single second. Click, click, click. Behind the desk sat Mr. Henderson, a sworn state notary with a bald head, thin gold-rimmed reading glasses, and 3 heavy brass official seals aligned in a neat row beside his green blotter. Glass partition walls enclosed the room, trapping the low hum of the overhead fluorescent tubes inside the small, sterile box. You couldn't just walk out once the official verification process began. The notary's legal protocol required all parties to remain seated inside the glass box until every signature on the commercial expansion agreement was witnessed, logged, and officially stamped. Chad pushed through the glass door behind us, dropping a heavy leather document holder onto the laminate desk with a dull, echoing thud. He adjusted the cuff of his linen blazer, the custom blazer bought with funds drawn directly from Vanessa's agency account, and turned to look over at me standing near the corner. I was holding the tall, top-heavy metal ring light stand. "Look at you, Nora," Chad said, letting out a short, nasal laugh as he leaned his shoulder against the doorframe. "You've got thread lint stuck to your collar and black grease under your fingernails. I mean, you honestly look like you just spent 6 hours crawling out of a coal chute. Make sure you keep that light completely steady. Vanessa's publicist needs her face properly illuminated for the live social media announcement, and we can't have you casting a shadow across her gown." I didn't answer him. I didn't even blink. I just gripped the cold steel pole of the ring light stand tighter. My thumb, the raw split blister from 6 months of cutting heavy wool coats with dull, rusted iron shears, throbbing with a dull, rhythmic ache against the bare metal. The ring light weighed at least 8 pounds, and holding it elevated at a 45-degree angle made my shoulder muscles burn with a sharp, sickening strain. But I held it dead still. I stood there in the corner like a piece of hired studio furniture, letting the harsh white LED glow beam directly onto Vanessa's profile while she adjusted her hair in the glass reflection. Vanessa pulled out the heavy leather-bound chair, sat down across from the notary, and placed her sleek designer fountain pen beside the loan agreement. She looked at Mr. Henderson with this deeply practiced, saintly expression, the soft, empathetic tilt of the head she always used right before she spun a lie. "I'm so sorry for the slight delay, Mr. Henderson," Vanessa said, her voice dropping into that smooth, soothing cadence she reserved for high-value clients. "My younger sister here is going through a very complex emotional crisis right now. Honestly, we've had to implement some strict personal boundaries with her today just to protect our peace and preserve our agency's positive alignment. She has a lot of unhealed financial anxiety that makes her react, well, let's just say she fixates on low-value scarcity metrics instead of trusting high-leverage growth strategies." The notary blinked behind his gold-rimmed glasses, clearing his throat quietly as he arranged the blue signature tabs on the 40-page commercial loan document. "We just want to make sure the broader family umbrella assets are properly optimized," Vanessa continued, casually reaching into her leather tote to adjust her gold watch, the watch purchased with the stolen wire funds. Nora's venue deposit was just stagnant capital sitting in an underperforming account. I merely reallocated those assets to scale our agency's regional market footprint. It's about building a sustainable legacy, even if some people are too emotionally unstable to understand the broader math. I watched her mouth move. I watched the fake silk of her $300 knockoff gown pucker along the side seam under the glare of my ring light. From where I stood, I could see the exact line where the cheap polyester thread was straining against the bias cut. In my line of work, when a person constructs a garment out of low-grade synthetic thread and pulls it too tight over a frame, it might look fine on a hanger for 5 minutes. But the second real physical pressure hits the seam, the second the fabric is forced to hold weight, the whole thing tears wide open. Vanessa reached out her manicured hand, her fingers wrapping smoothly around the polished body of the fountain pen. She looked up at the notary, offered a condescending, victorious little smile, and prepared to press the nib down onto the signature line to execute another $20,000 debt load against our mother's name. I just looked at her sitting there, under that glaring ring light, adjusting her fake silk dress and sipping her iced drink, and I wondered if she had any idea how fast a fake empire burns to the ground when you cut the oxygen off at the root. Because the certified papers resting inside the white envelope in my apron pocket were about to give her the answer. Vanessa's fountain pen hovered less than half an inch above the crisp blue signature line. Her hand was steady, her manicured nails catching the sharp fluorescent light from the ceiling panels. She tilted her head, offering Mr. Henderson a warm, practiced smile that was supposed to project total corporate authority. I didn't scream. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't step forward with some dramatic theatrical speech like you see in late-night television dramas. Instead, I slowly lowered the 8-pound metal ring light stand. The steel base settled onto the polished terrazzo floor with a soft, dull metallic clink. My right hand was trembling. A deep, involuntary biological adrenaline dump that made my knuckles ache and my vision narrow around the edges for 3 sickening seconds. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird beating its wings against a cage, but I forced my fingers to flatten against the cool fabric of my apron. A single ice cube shifted and clinked softly against the inside of Vanessa's glass. That was the only sound in the room. I stepped forward to the laminate desk. I reached into the deep front pocket of my canvas apron, pulled out the thick white envelope, and unsealed the flap. Without saying a single word, I executed a quiet, level movement, sliding 4 crisp, laser-printed pages directly across the green desk blotter, placing them flat on top of the loan agreement, right under the nib of Vanessa's fountain pen. Mr. Henderson paused. He looked down through his gold-rimmed reading glasses at the top page resting on his desk. The page was a certified stamped fraud affidavit issued directly by the bank's fiduciary compliance division, complete with the state seal embedded in the digital header. Attached right below it was the certified cashier's receipt from Guangzhou Apex Garment Exports, showing the exact itemized transaction. Aurelia synthetic satin bridal gown. Total paid $299.99. Payment method: authorized wire transfer number WT-9921. The notary's fingers froze. He didn't sign. He didn't move his stamp. He slowly picked up the top page, his eyes scanning the certified numbers, the timestamps, and the matching umbrella account reference codes. "What is this?" Mr. Henderson asked, his voice dropping an octave, becoming entirely professional and cold. "That is the receipt for the dress she is currently wearing," I said. My voice was low, completely even, completely stripped of emotion. She told our family it was a $15,000 custom Italian silk gown. She paid $300 for a mass-produced synthetic knockoff using funds drawn directly from a $35,000 unauthorized wire transfer. A transfer executed using my forged digital authorization. Vanessa's face went dead white. The saintly, empathetic smile on her lips didn't just fade, it shattered, leaving her mouth open in a weird, frozen line. "Nora, what kind of ridiculous lie is this?" Vanessa stammered, her voice rising an octave, cracking slightly on the last word. She reached out to snatch the paper off the desk, but Mr. Henderson immediately pressed his heavy palm flat down on the document, pulling it out of her reach. "Mr. Henderson, ignore her! She is having a severe emotional episode. She is mentally unstable." "This document bears a certified state compliance seal, Ms. Vance," Mr. Henderson said, his voice flat as stone. He pulled the commercial expansion loan agreement completely away from her side of the desk, sliding her fountain pen into his drawer. "And under state notary regulations, I am legally prohibited from witnessing or notarizing any commercial instrument attached to an umbrella entity currently flagged for active fiduciary fraud." "No, wait!" Vanessa stood up so fast, her leather-bound chair scraped backward against the floorboards with a sharp, screaming screech. "That's an administrative error. It's a temporary capital allocation. My agency is in the middle of a major regional expansion." "Look at the second page, Mr. Henderson," I said softly, pointing a calloused finger at the second sheet on the stack. The notary flipped the page. It was the commercial guarantee agreement for the $20,000 high-interest personal loan. The loan Vanessa had submitted 3 days ago. I turned slightly, looking over at my mother, who was sitting in the corner armchair holding her leather handbag. Cynthia had been watching with a confused, condescending frown, ready to jump to Vanessa's defense. I took that second sheet, stepped across the small room, and laid it directly on my mother's lap. "Read the co-signer's signature, Mom," I said. Cynthia blinked, pulling her reading glasses out of her purse. Her eyes tracked down the legal lines of the commercial debt agreement, settling on the designated guarantor section at the bottom of the page. Designated co-signer and personal guarantor. Cynthia Vance. Execution method, digital signature authorization. The color drained from my mother's face so fast, it looked like she had been slapped. The fake medical routine, the dramatic gasping for air, the hands clutched over her sternum, the tearful claims of a hypertensive crisis, vanished instantly. Her mouth twitched. She stood up, her hands trembling so violently that the heavy paper slipped from her grip and fluttered onto the floor, hyperventilating with raw, terrified realization. "Vanessa?" Cynthia whispered, her voice trembling with a raw, terrified realization I had never heard from her before. "What is my name doing on a $20,000 personal loan? You told me this was just a promotional mailing waiver." "Mom, listen to me," Vanessa stammered, stepping toward her, her hands waving frantically in the air. "It's just a strategic bridge loan. My agency's high-value client pipeline is about to clear next month. I was going to pay it off before the first installment." "You signed my name?" Cynthia's voice cracked, turning into an angry, high-pitched shriek that echoed off the glass walls. "You signed my house onto a 32% interest commercial debt? Without asking me?" "Mom, stop making a scene in front of the notary," Vanessa hissed, her eyes darting nervously toward the glass door, where 2 office clerks had paused to watch. "You're ruining my brand alignment." "Your brand?" Chad interrupted. Chad had been standing by the door, staring at the 3rd sheet of paper on the desk, the printed screenshot of Vanessa's deleted text message from the family group chat. The message where she explicitly admitted to clearing my wedding account to pay for her resort photo shoot while planning to trick me into signing a liability release. Chad looked from the printed screenshot to the $300 dress receipt, then up at Vanessa. The arrogant, smirking expression he had carried all morning was completely gone, replaced by a look of sheer, cold disgust. "You don't have an agency pipeline," Chad said, his voice flat, devoid of any affection. "You don't have corporate clients. You spent $34,000 of her money on a 4-day resort weekend so you could post photos on the internet." "Chad, baby, no!" Vanessa reached out to grab his arm, her manicured fingers catching the sleeve of his linen blazer. "You know my firm is expanding. You know the market footprint." "Don't touch me," Chad snapped, pulling his arm back so hard his cuff button caught on her dress seam. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his luxury car key fob, the leased car paid for by Vanessa's drained account, and dropped it onto the laminate desk with a heavy plastic click. "I'm not getting dragged into a civil fraud lawsuit for your social media page. We're done." He turned around, shoved the glass door open, and walked out into the corridor without looking back once. The silence that fell over the room after the door swung shut was suffocating. My mother was sitting back down in her chair, weeping quietly into a tissue, staring at the floor as if the ground beneath her feet had opened up. Vanessa stood in the center of the glass office, her high heels planted on the terrazzo, her synthetic dress puckering along the hip where I had pinned it 20 minutes ago on the dirty asphalt. I reached down into my apron pocket one last time. I pulled out the $10 coffee gift card Vanessa had sent me that morning, along with the printed receipt from her automated message. I walked over to the desk and placed the small slip of paper right beside her sleek fountain pen. To help cover your civil legal consultations, I said softly. The civil injunction is already locked with the notary, Vanessa, so you can stop smoothing your fake silk because I have a wedding dress to alter. Vanessa's hands began to move in small, frantic, rhythmic circles over the front of her ivory dress. She wasn't looking at me anymore. She wasn't looking at the notary, or a mother weeping into her tissues in the corner, or the heavy glass door where Chad had vanished 3 seconds ago. Her manicured fingers just kept smoothing the fake synthetic fabric down over her hips, over and over, rubbing the cheap polyester weave until the friction made a dull, swishing sound in the dead quiet of the room. "It's just a clerical delay," she whispered, her voice airy, detached, completely severed from the reality of the paper resting under Mr. Henderson's palm. A faint, nervous tremor twitched at the corner of her top lip, but she kept forcing a wide, glassy smile onto her face. "Honestly, it's just a temporary asset alignment issue. My assistant is going to resolve the documentation hash by 4 o'clock. We are optimizing the regional brand footprint, Mr. Henderson. You don't need to call compliance. My firm has high-value liquidity clearing by Friday." Mr. Henderson didn't answer her. He picked up his desk telephone, dialed a 3-digit internal extension, and spoke into the receiver without taking his eyes off her shaking hands.
"Compliance, this is Desk 4. I have a flagged umbrella entity with an active fiduciary fraud affidavit. Freeze the signature line on instrument 4920-B immediately."
No, you don't understand. Vanessa's voice cracked into a sharp, breathy squeak, her fingers clawing at her dress seam as if trying to smooth out a wrinkle that wasn't there. "The math is fine. The ROI is projected at 300%. I just need to access the client portal. I have a high-leverage wire incoming." She whipped her phone out of her tote bag, her thumb tapping the screen with frantic, erratic speed. She was trying to open her business banking app, trying to manually execute an emergency wire transfer to move whatever remaining funds she had into an unflagged secondary account before the bank system shut her out completely. I didn't try to stop her. I didn't say a single word. I stood by the door with my arms folded across my apron, watching her fingers fly across the glowing glass. And then the application stalled, refusing to refresh. A dull gray error banner dropped down across the top of her interface. I could see the reflection of the text glowing in her wide, unblinking eyes. Error 401. Account access frozen by fiduciary injunction. Contact Compliance Administrator. Vanessa tapped the red retry icon. Once, twice, 5 times, 10 times. Her manicured nail clacked against the glass like a frantic woodpecker. Clack, 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 clack. Her breathing turning into shallow, dry rasps. "It's just a network glitch," she muttered to the empty room, her thumb pounding the glass until the screen went dark. "It's just a temporary system update. My publicist is fixing the server." She couldn't process it. Her brain, built entirely on 10 years of corporate jargon and unearned social media praise, simply refused to integrate the fact that a piece of paper and a certified cashier's receipt had just permanently dismantled her fake empire. She just stood there in the center of that air-conditioned glass box, surrounded by the smell of floor wax and stale coffee, smoothing her $300 fake silk gown over and over again, while the notary quietly filed his reports. Look, real civil justice doesn't happen like a Hollywood movie. There were no flashing sirens in the parking lot that afternoon, no dramatic arrests on the evening news. Real domestic recovery is slow, quiet, and agonizingly administrative. It took 3 months. 3 months of certified letters arriving in white, windowed envelopes. 3 months of the bank's internal fraud division executing a total forensic audit on Vance Media and Events, LLC. Because once a financial institution sees a verified forged wire transfer and an unauthorized signature on a commercial loan, they don't negotiate. They don't listen to speeches about brand alignment or high-value exposure. They simply execute cold, automated legal clawbacks. By late September, the bank's Civil Recovery Department had legally seized every single dollar sitting in Vanessa's agency checking accounts, forcing a complete restitution sweep that returned the full $35,000 directly into my protected venue escrow account. My wedding contract was reinstated, the breach penalty was dismissed, my small tailoring LLC was legally cleared of all liability. And as for the ecosystem Vanessa had built around herself, it didn't just break, it cannibalized itself. Chad didn't just walk out of the escrow office that day. He filed a formal civil disclaimer with his own bank to distance himself from her firm's tax filings. Within 48 hours, the luxury sports car he loved to brag about at Sunday dinners was repossessed from his driveway because the lease payments, drawn from Vanessa's fraudulent accounts, bounced higher than a rubber ball. The last I heard, he was working 12-hour shifts as an entry-level fleet manager in an industrial warehouse 2 counties over, avoiding the calls of debt collectors who were trying to track down his secondary signatures. My mother, Cynthia, paid the ultimate price for her lifelong indoctrination. She had spent 20 years protecting Vanessa's public image, sacrificing her own relationship with me just to keep the golden child on a pedestal. But when the high-interest commercial loan went into default, the lending firm didn't care about motherly love or family harmony. They attached a formal civil lien to her primary bank accounts. The scandal didn't stay secret. In a suburban town where everyone talks, news of the forged loan and the bank fraud swept through her country club's social circle like wildfire. The same wealthy friends my mother used to brag to about Vanessa's glamorous consulting firm suddenly stopped inviting her to Tuesday luncheons. They stopped answering her phone calls. They looked the other way when she walked down the aisle at the grocery store. She was completely excommunicated from the only social world she had ever cared about, left sitting alone in her silent, overly pristine living room, staring at a stack of defaulted debt notices she couldn't afford to pay. And then there was Vanessa. When you build a career on lying to high net worth clients, a public civil fraud injunction is an absolute death sentence. Within 6 weeks, every single client on her event roster terminated their contracts. Her publicist dropped her. Her agency was forced into involuntary liquidation to satisfy the bank's clawback demands. She couldn't afford her luxury high-rise apartment anymore. She couldn't afford her lease payments, her $70 matcha lattes, or her $300 hair appointments. By November, Vanessa was living in a dreary ground-floor rental unit on the far south side of town. A cramped, damp apartment sitting 20 feet away from an active industrial rail yard, where the heavy freight trains rumbled past every 40 minutes, shaking the thin window panes and filling the small rooms with the smell of diesel exhaust and brake dust. I didn't go visit her, but 2 weeks after my wedding, Maya dropped by her place to drop off a box of old personal items our mother had purged from the attic. Maya told me she walked into Vanessa's dismal little kitchen and found our older sister standing in front of a rusted, 20-year-old laundry dryer that came with the unit. The dryer was making a loud, rhythmic screeching noise, overheating, blowing hot, damp air into the small kitchen. Vanessa was standing there in a faded fleece sweatshirt, her eyes red-rimmed, staring at the control panel of the old appliance like it was an alien spacecraft. She was literally on the verge of tears, throwing a complete, weeping psychological breakdown in the middle of her kitchen. Why? Because the dryer's lint filter was full, and the machine had shut off its heating element as a safety precaution. Vanessa didn't know how to pull the plastic screen out. She didn't know how to scrape the lint off with her fingers. She had spent her entire adult life relying on my unseen, unacknowledged domestic labor to handle every single practical detail of her existence. Cleaning her clothes, fixing her seams, ironing her linen, managing her household logistics, while she paraded around as a corporate alpha, sitting in that dismal rental kitchen, surrounded by the roar of passing freight trains and the smell of hot lint. The great luxury wedding consultant was completely defeated by an old piece of mesh. She had tried to run her life like a high-value empire, but when the synthetic facade was stripped away, there was nothing underneath. No practical skills, no structural integrity, just an empty shell of a person who didn't even know how to clear a lint trap without a scapegoat there to do it for her. 2 weeks after the bank finalized the restitution sweep, my mother showed up at my workshop door. It was 4 o'clock on a rainy Thursday afternoon. She didn't ring the brass bell. She just pushed the wooden door open and stood on the concrete landing, holding a dripping black umbrella. She looked, well, let's just say she looked 30 years older than she had 3 months ago. Her hair was pulled back into an unstyled bun, her eyes were sunken and shadowed, and the expensive silk scarf she loved to wear was frayed along the selvage edge. "Nora," she whispered, her voice trembling as she stepped down the stairs. I brought you some letters from the old mail slot. I thought you might want them." She set a small stack of unopened junk mail on the edge of my pressing board. She didn't look at my face. Her eyes kept darting around my shop, taking in the clean garment racks, the bright daylight lamps, the freshly pressed rolls of silk sitting ready for my weekend appointments. She's having a very hard time, Nora," Cynthia said, her hands clutching her handbag so tightly the synthetic leather puckered under her fingers. "The debt collection agency is attaching a judgment to her rental unit. She can't even afford her grocery bills this week. I mean, she's your sister. We're a family. If you could talk to the bank's civil department, tell them it was an internal misunderstanding. Maybe they would drop the interest penalties on my co-signed loan." I looked at her. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel a surge of satisfaction or hatred. When a tailor cuts away a rotten section of cloth to save the rest of the bolt, you don't hate the discarded piece. You just recognize that its structural integrity failed under tension. Sitting there looking at my mother, I realized the bitter truth about her. Cynthia wasn't an evil mastermind. She was just a deeply broken, exhausted woman who had spent 40 years running on a martyr's indoctrination. A woman who truly believed that sacrificing her own dignity, her own money, and her scapegoat child to preserve a fake family image was a sacred duty. She was trapped in a cage she had built with her own hands. Look, when you cut a rotten sleeve away from a garment, there's no dramatic explosion. There's no sudden, violent tearing sound. There's just the raw, exposed edge of the cloth, the frayed threads sitting quiet where a seam used to join 2 pieces together. That's the exact void I felt in my chest as I looked at her. It wasn't a sudden ache. It was simply the structural reality that the bond between us had run out of thread. "I can't undo the bank's investigation, Mom," I said, my voice completely flat, completely calm. "The wire was fraudulent. The signature on your loan was forged. The bank acted on facts, not family arguments." But what am I supposed to do?" Cynthia's voice rose into a thin, pathetic squeak, a tear rolling down the deep wrinkles beside her nose. "The country club canceled my membership. The neighbors won't speak to me. Everything I built, everything I did to keep this family looking respectable, it's all ruined." "You chose the illusion, Mom," I said softly. And the illusion broke. I reached into my apron pocket. My fingers wrapped around a heavy, tarnished brass key ring, the original keys to my mother's house. The keys she had handed me when I was 16 years old. The keys to the room where I used to sit alone on Friday nights while they took Vanessa out for state dinners. I pulled the key ring out and set it down flat on the wooden pressing table between us. Clink. The metal sounded loud and final against the scorched oak. "I don't live in that house anymore," I said. "And I'm not fixing the seams in it ever again." Cynthia stared at the brass keys sitting on the wood. She opened her mouth to say something, to deliver another guilt trip, another performance of gasping breath, but the look in my eyes must have stopped her. There was no anger for her to feed on, just dead, quiet space. She slowly reached out, picked up the keys, slid them into her purse, and turned around. She walked back up my basement steps, her heels clicking softly on the concrete, and closed the heavy wooden door behind her. I didn't watch her walk down the alleyway. The structural integrity of our bloodline was permanently severed. I didn't feel rage, and I didn't feel a phantom ache for the family I never had. In tailoring, when a rotten sleeve is cut from the bolt, you don't mourn the discarded scraps. You simply accept that the fabric failed under tension. I turned back to my wooden ham, picked up my heavy iron, and let the quiet take over. The ledger was closed. 3 days later, the bank's formal restitution order cleared through the civil clearinghouse. The full $35,000 was wire transferred directly into my venue's protected escrow account. The venue director called me personally to apologize for the administrative stress, confirming that my deposit was locked, my date was secured, and my milestone was safe. My wedding took place 6 weeks later. It wasn't a $50,000 resort spectacle built on stolen money and fake social media posts. It was a quiet, intimate ceremony in a sunlit brick courtyard behind a local bakery, surrounded by 20 people who actually loved us, including Marco, who sat in the front row wearing his best wool suit, smiling quietly as I walked down the aisle, and Maya. Maya sat right beside him, her college textbooks tucked safely in her bag, her sophomore semester fully paid for and secure. Now, it's 8 o'clock on a Tuesday morning. Sunlight is pouring through the high transom window of my basement workshop, cutting through the quiet morning air and illuminating the fine floating threads of white silk hanging near my cutting table. The air smells of clean steam, pressing wax, and fresh unbleached linen. I stand at my pressing table, holding a piece of heavy cream-colored silk drape for a client's evening gown. In my left hand, I hold my grandmother's old wooden tailoring ham. The wood was worn perfectly smooth by decades of calloused skin pressing against it, a physical anchor to a lifetime of sheer, unglamorous grit. I can feel the tiny, microscopic scars in the grain where her needles accidentally caught the wood 40 years ago. Imperfections that were smoothed down by decades of relentless, patient labor. I set the dense wooden ham under the curved shoulder seam of the silk gown. I lift my heavy iron, holding it firmly in my right hand. My thumb doesn't throb anymore. The raw blister left by my old iron shears has finally healed, leaving a tough, smooth callus over the joint, a permanent mark of survival. A thick, clean cloud of white steam rises from the iron, wrapping around my hands, filling the sunlit workshop with the warm, rich scent of pressed silk. The seam flattens perfectly against the smooth wood of the ham, clean, straight, and unruptured under the heat. I set the iron back on its pad. I run my fingers over the finished seam. The grain holds. The thread is tight, and for the first time in my life, the room is completely quiet.